James, I have to say, there's been a lot of conversation around this today, around a few different components of this story. First and foremost, whether or not stop and searches actually make a difference. Secondly, whether they disproportionately affect, say, ethnic minorities. And thirdly, whether this whole kind of concept of Section 60, where basically you can enforce this ability to basically stop anyone that you like for a set period of time. Now they've made amendments so that they don't have to inform the community that that is going to be the case. So you can pick any of those aspects and tell me what you think.
Well, I think you're right on it, Michelle. The main concern in much of the media, certainly the liberal media, is the reputedly disproportionate effect on black people. And it was Theresa May, in fact, who first raised that. I find that not entirely convincing in 2021. I think if a black person is picked up driving a BMW, the reasons are also a bit to do with class. They're not just to do with race. And I put it to you that identity politics has given us a rather narrow and myopic prism through which to look at knife crime. We're not allowed to discuss pet parenting in the discussion on knife crime.
You can discuss anything
no,
you want.
I'm talking about the mainstream view. Now, what worries me about Section 60 is that the target could so easily become your third component. You know, just about anybody who the police one morning decide may be, likely to inflict violence and serious violence. And it's the subjunctive and their judgment that we have to trust. And I think when you look at the wider panoply of what's happening in Britain with laws and free speech and cancel culture and lots of other things, I hold no brief for Extinction Rebellion, but if they protest in a reasonable way, they're allowed to do that. That's what democracy is. And I worry not that they will be targeted, that they will in fact assist the targeting of anybody with a serious cause who, for arbitrary reasons, is not liked. And this is part of an international trend. So I'm worried more about the threat to democratic rights in Section 60, and no, I have not read every clause of it.
So are you, in essence, are you against the policy change that Priti Patel has announced today, i.e. making it easier to introduce a Section 60? Are you against that?
I think I am against that, and I think, on the other hand, I wouldn't deny that Stop and Search has produced some results, that she pointed to 50,000 knives being taken off the streets. But you and I know that to die at the hands of a knife is a terrible, terrible thing, but just taking knives off the streets and enforcing more draconian legislation is not the way to deal with a deep-seated problem that is in a number of communities, white as well as black. It goes much further. So this thing is ratcheting up the Stop and Search, and I think it's quite worrying.
Nick, where do you stand?
Well, I mostly agree in the sense of I'm against it. For most of the same reasons, I think.
You're against what? Stop and Search as a thing?
No, just
or
the
expansion?
Right. The expansion of it. I mean,
the relaxation.
The relaxation. So Priti Patel has said Stop and Search has increased by 85% since 2019, and some 50,000 weapons have been taken off the streets. So what's the need to extend this? It sounds like it's working probably as well as it can do. I really do worry about the overreach of the Home Office, particularly on this sort of thing, on policing. We've already had a policing bill, which really restricts protesting, and now we've had this. And it's basically come to a point, I mean, to put it into perspective, let's say there was another lockdown and people wanted to go to Trafalgar Square and protest lockdowns. And there's this kind of assumption that it's like, well, this is just going to affect left-wing groups. This is just going to affect Extinction Rebellion, people I don't like. Well, yeah, you try and have a lockdown. It's going to be anybody. And you're giving police huge powers that I don't think have really been thought about enough.
But if I may, Michelle.
You may, James.
It's not every day that a government minister with some modest distinction, such as Kit Malthouse, describes Stop and Search as a blunt instrument. And I think what we're faced with here is the same problem we're going to discuss with energy prices, which is, to use this blunt instrument, which I believe, the conditions where Gang A fights Gang B seem to me to have very little to do with the words that I've been reading in Section 60. It seems to have a much wider remit and a very fuzzy remit, if I may say. So you can't start from just the predicament of the victims or their racial composition and all of that. One has to start with a wider discussion and action about the deeper causes of this. You know, I hate to quote Tony Blair, which is the causes of crime.
I think focusing on the victims is actually pretty relevant.
Well, yeah, but then you're not going to find a long-term solution, Ruth. You're just going to rush in and say, right, freeze this whole SW1 area.
I'm just thinking of the victims, and I'm just thinking of how best to actually do something about tackling knife crime, which is a major problem. And it is
Nobody's denying that.
And by the way, if there was some intel that there was a potential knife fight about to occur in my postcode, I'm going to be absolutely blunt and honest here. I absolutely would want everything possible done to try and get the knives off the street.
Everything possible done to deal with that problem does not ring out from the legislation that I've managed to have a look at. Yeah, what rings out is just a wider we can do anything. You point to the hours, you point to the seniority of the people able to do this. You can dignify it, if you like, Michelle, by saying, we've received some intel. What I want to know is who makes the call after Cressida Dick about there may be serious violence in this area. And that's not to deny the terrible nature of knife crime or the nature of the victims or the perpetrator. I just want to know that this legislation does not go through the overreach that Nick has spoken about.
Well, I agree with you about that.
But I don't know why you would be... I mean, what we're talking about here is someone being checked to see whether or not they're carrying an offensive weapon. But I wouldn't have concerns about that. What I would say...
We know the police can be very difficult sometimes.
Yeah, and what I would say,
Having been stopped by the police because they thought I was a little boy driving a car.
They thought you was a little boy?
Because I was driving my car, and of course I drive quite quickly, and they stopped me because they thought I was a lad who'd stolen a car.
Have you got a boy racer car with, like, twin exhausts and spoilers?
And I'm not joking. They looked at me. Surely they realised that I was, in fact, an incredibly ancient old woman. But actually, then they asked me to step out of the car and then asked me what the registration of the car was. Don't look, they said.
And did you pass your test? Did you guess your registration right?
Look here, my man, I said.
Look here, my man.
That's the spirit.
I mean, joking apart, sometimes the police are not as helpful as they might be. Let me put it that way.
But I think what's wrong with that? So if they've suspected you of wrongdoing and they've asked you to... They've decided to investigate what's occurring, that's their job. That's what they should do.
Because they said I was driving and they didn't expect a woman to be driving like that. In other words, I was driving.
Michelle, surely...
Was you driving too fast, Ruth?
I never drive too fast.
I'm not convinced. I've
not got that many points on my licence.
Jessie says, by the way, she's emailed or he's emailed. I shouldn't assume gender these days. You get in trouble for that, don't you? Michelle, if you've not got anything to hide, then why would you be worried about this? The only point I would make, actually, is because I've seen, we all probably have seen, people being stopped and searched. And I've often felt very uncomfortable in the manner at which it's conducted. Because if you're just an innocent person going about your business, from what I've seen, every single time I've ever seen it happen, it's conducted in full view of everybody. There's no dignity. There's no kind of, like, if you imagine, if you're just minding your own business, wandering down the street, and a copper comes up to you and says, right, I'm going to frisk you, I'm going to do this and this and this. I would want and I would expect some decency, some dignity in that experience. And I think that the police are not always doing that.
That's one of the deeper causes of this whole problem, right? If you look at the police training college in Hendon, they're much more interested in pronouns for a long time than actually doing something about knife crime, and just as they're not very interested in burglaries. So the reform of this, I'm not into police bashing, don't get me wrong, but the reform of the police and less arbitrary, less prejudiced actions by the police is definitely on the agenda. There was that girl who was strip searched in her school by two police women, and they hated doing it, but nevertheless they did it. So then we have, it's not a question of Priti Patel or white supremacy, but then we have Priti Patel rushing in and saying no, we need some cast a dragnet or whatever it is over a whole area, and yet this stuff is still still going to go on, Michelle, and what the stuff that you were subjected to.
Well,
I just laughed because I've got a sense of humour. But, I mean, joking apart, yes, I basically support what Priti Patel is doing, but with reservations, and it does need to be done with tact.
And that's my worry. I don't think it will be.
Yeah, and Bob says, in my humble opinion, if anyone has stopped and searched, they have nothing to fear unless they call carrying something illegal. He goes on to say, after all, we don't all object to being searched at airports. Well, Bob, what I'd say to you, if you've ever had your bag, you know, they go through the thing and then sometimes your bag gets stopped. I have objected multiple times, actually, because what they've done is in front of everybody, you've seen what you go through the conveyor belt, in front of everyone, you have to queue up and they go, right, who does this bag belong to? You go, me. Then they empty the bag in front of everybody. And I would say, excuse me, can you not do that, please? Can you, like, this is my private belongings, you're getting them out in front of everyone. And I just think there's no privacy. So actually, I've got a problem with that. So if I have a problem with my bag being rummaged in wherever airport, you know, you can absolutely concede that if you are being frisked and pockets and emptied in the middle of everyone, it's degrading.
It's horrible.
There should be a better way of doing that. The way of doing it is wrong.
I must say, to hear the old argument, you know, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear.
But it's the way they do it.
That doesn't do it, you know, because you could get away with anything that way.